and this is a philosophical question, what is undermining the Australian economy? Anyway, let's move on. We're going to take questions at the end of the two lectures, so save up on your questions. And now it is my great pleasure to welcome Bill Lazonik. Bill is a distinguished visiting professor at UTS. He has held senior posts at Executive Business School INSEAD at the University of Tokyo, Columbia University, and Harvard University. He's obviously very entrepreneurial because he's been awarded 38 major research grants from international agencies for pioneering work on finance, innovation, and competition, the knowledge-based economy, venture creation and venture finance, skill formation, economic performance and technology, industrial innovation, and economic policy. He's received a research grant from the European Commission, Sixth Framework Programme, the US National Science Foundation, Division of Social and Economic Sciences, Targeted Socio-Economic Research Programme of the European Commission, the Centre for Global Partnership, Japan Foundation, and his most recent book is Sustainable Prosperity in the New Economy, ? Business Organisation and High-Tech Employment in the US. Please join me in welcoming Bill Lazonik.
Okay, it's a pleasure to be here and to see so many people come to listen to what I have to say. Now, the title of my talk is Sustainable Prosperity in the New Economy. You'll see that's also a title of a book that is just mentioned that I've written recently. It's in many ways heartening to come to a place where you can ask if you can keep the good times going. No one's asking that in the United States. People see, since really the financial crisis of 2008, that times have not been good. And it's not clear how you're going to turn the corner. What are good times? Well, and here probably is one of the few areas where most economists would probably agree with me. You want to have economic growth. You want to get higher standards of living over time through economic growth, but you want the gains of that growth to be shared equitably among the people who contribute to it, and you want stability in employment and income. It's not subject to boom and bust. Now, by this definition, you can first of all look at economic growth. The United States, which I'll talk about now, has had economic growth up and down a bit, but over the last 4 decades, you can see here, 5 decades, we've had growth. And in fact, around now, the per capita income is about twice as high as it was in the early 70s. So insofar as there's more to be shared out, it's there in the United States. The problem is this growth has been quite unstable, and it appears to be becoming more unstable. And it's also led to some dramatic changes, which I'll talk about. There's a bit of a complicated chart. Dramatic changes in employment, which since the 1980s have led to an erosion of what people call the erosion of middle-class jobs. Jobs that provided stable incomes, rising incomes over time, careers have disappeared. And in the 1980s, they started disappearing for blue-collar workers, generally with high school education. But in the last decade, even the last 2 decades, that's been the fate of people even with higher education. In fact, I read a report a couple weeks ago in the New York Times that there were more college-educated people unemployed in the United States than non-college educated people now. It's been a very inequitable growth. Here you can see average productivity, the yellow line going up over time, but wages remaining on average stagnant, except if you're in the top 1%, and you can see that your incomes have climbed. And I'll show you some other indicators of this. This is the Gini coefficient, which basically measures a measure of inequality. If all families in the households in the economy had the exact same income, the Gini coefficient would be 0. If one family had all the income in the economy, I guess Gina Reinhardt or could almost qualify, then it would be 1. Okay. Well, a rising Gini coefficient shows more inequality. As you can see, in the post-World War II decades in the United States, you had a trend toward increasing more equality. Not a very marked trend, but there was a trend toward more equality. Whereas since the 1970s, there's been a very marked trend toward inequality. These data show the proportion of income of the U.S. population that is held by, in this case, the top 1%, the top half of 1%, and the top 1/10 of 1%. So the bottom line, the green line, is the top 1/10 of 1%. And you can see that in recent years, it's been as high as 12% of all income has been controlled by the top 1/10 of 1%. If you go to the top 1%, it's been as high as about 23% of all income. It's a highly unequal distribution of income. I'll come back to that as well. Now, I talk about the changes that have occurred in the U.S. economy over the last 4 or 5 decades in terms of a transition from an old economy business model to a new economy business model. We're called old and new that doesn't mean too much until you start talking about what is actually the content of this. Okay, under the old economy business model, basically, if you got a job with a corporation, a business corporation, whether you were a blue-collar worker or a white-collar worker, you could generally have the expectation that you would have that job for a career. At the end of the career, you would have a defined benefit pension, which would basically maintain your income until the time you died. Within that business model, there was a very limited role of the stock market in the operation of the corporation. Basically, the role of the stock market in the corporation in the United States up until the 1970s was to separate ownership from control. Basically, an owner-entrepreneur built up a company. They then went public with the company. They often took the money, retired from the scene, and in their place were professional managers. And this is basically the way the economy ran. And this was not something that happened like in the 1950s and 60s. It really happened in the 1910s and 1920s. So the preeminent business historian, Alfred Chandler, who wrote a book in 1977 called The Visible Hand, The Managerial Revolution in American Business, basically in that book documented how by 1920 the managerial revolution was complete. The people who ran American business corporations, which in turn dominated the economy even back then, were professional managers who rose up through the ranks and were basically running those corporations in a kind of a trusteeship mode. And they often talked in those terms, that they were running corporations for the employees, for the customers, even for the nation. Okay, these corporations, and you don't want to oversell how soulful they were, but compared to what we have now, they were. They created a lot of high-quality jobs in the United States. Jobs where people got more training over time, where, again, they could expect stable employment over a career. There was also a highly progressive income tax structure, and anybody who knows the United States now might find that kind of strange because Americans seem to be hell-bent on having low income taxes, and anybody who wants to raise income taxes is thrown out of office immediately. But back in the United States, back in this period in the United States, and this was not something the elite objected to, it's something they actually recognized they needed. You had a very progressive income tax structure with the highest marginal tax rate as high as 91% in the 1950s. Now, there was always tax loopholes, etc., nevertheless, it was highly progressive. And you had the government investing in physical infrastructure and something that's cut off on the bottom of this slide, the knowledge base. And in fact, I would argue the United States, which there's an ideology that goes around in the United States, the government shouldn't intervene in anything, doesn't intervene in anything, or anytime it intervenes, it does harm. In fact, you would not have any major industry in the United States if there haven't been decades of government investment in the infrastructure, the knowledge base for that industry before that industry actually came online and started delivering goods and services. And I could go through many examples. I'll come back to some of these. Now, the business model that replaced it, which arose from about the 1970s, was based on technologies, high-tech technologies, particularly the ICT industries, the information communication technology industry, the microelectronics revolution. It's basically the application of technologies in PCs and in the internet, which had been developed in the old economy, either by the government or old economy business corporations, which at that time still invested in basic technology. And the stock market started to play a much bigger role in the operation of these companies. And basically it came to play two roles that it hadn't played before. One was you started using the stock market to attract capital to startups. And this is what is people known as the Silicon Valley model. Venture capital came along, and you had a stock market, which was created in 1971, really an electronic stock market out of, or called the over-the-counter markets that were fragmented across the United States. You created a national market on which it was very easy to list stocks. NASDAQ, the National Association of Securities Dealers Automated Quotation System. This came online in 1971, and it meant that if you had a company that you wanted to get quoted nationally, you could do that very easily with very little capitalization requirements, very little profitability, often no products. This is something that you could not do, and you can't do to this day on the New York Stock Exchange, which is the other major national stock exchange. That was one thing. The other thing is in the 1970s and 1980s, if you had a Silicon Valley type startup and you wanted to get scientists, engineers, managers, any kind of people with any capabilities to come work for it, you're actually competing against old economy companies which were offering those people career employment, stability of employment, and as I said before, pensions at the end that were based on their salaries, years of service. And as a startup, you couldn't possibly say, well, we're going to offer you that as well, because you didn't know whether you'd be around in 2 or 3 years, 5 years. So what they offered was stock options. They said, here's a mode of compensation that can induce you to give up job security. And in fact, if you got a job with an Apple or Microsoft or Cisco, etc., and they went public, you could make a lot out of the stock options. Not just the people at the top, but people right down through the organization. And in addition to this, top executives got these stock options, but they got multiples of what most other people got. In fact, I've documented this in many of these companies. The multiples are 100 to 1,000 to 1. So you can actually, the most dramatic example is Microsoft in the year 2000, the peak of the internet boom. Across about 37,000 people who worked in Microsoft, I calculated the average gains from stock options across 37,000 people. We don't actually know the distribution among those people. The average gains was $450,000 per person from exercising stock. And that was most extreme, and that was because of the stock market boom. The people at the top got about 100 times that amount. So, and 45 million, even 100 million, $200 million from exercising stock options are not unknown for the top executives. Now, at the same time, in the name of high-tech innovation, the people coming out of Silicon Valley, particularly, started lobbying in the late 1970s for lower taxes. They said, if we don't get lower taxes, we're not going to innovate. And so they, in fact, were the ones who started pushing for lower taxes. In the United States, this is often identified with Ronald Reagan in the early 1980s, but really the driving force behind this was the National Venture Capital Association and the American Electronics Association, which came out of Silicon Valley in the 1970s. And to this day, this is the mantra, is that you need low taxes to get entrepreneurship, innovation. In fact, what you need get with low taxes is just people making a lot of money, and I'll show you not investing in innovation. Now, I've written about all this. Again, it's a little cut off. Oh, no, it's not cut off as much here. in this book called Sustainable Prosperity in the New Economy, ? Business organization, high-tech employment in the United States. If anybody's interested, they can read a lot of the gory details in the book. Okay, what does a business model do? Thomas talked a little bit about this. It transforms productive resources into goods and services that can be sold to generate revenues. And there's three types of activities that a business enterprise engages in to do this. It has to have a strategy. It has to have someone making decisions about how to allocate resources to produce for particular product markets using particular processes. It has to develop an organization to develop the capabilities of those resources. So you don't just transform inputs into outputs. You figure out how to, in fact, add value to those productive resources. That's what a business organization does. And to do this, it has to sustain this process from the time you make the investment till you generate returns, and that's why you need finance. Now, if you want to engage in innovation, which is in fact how you can get a competitive advantage on product markets and generate the sustained growth of a company, you have to recognize that there's three characteristics of the innovation process that have to, with which a business enterprise has to deal. The first is uncertainty. And a lot of economists talk about optimal this, optimal that. Well, there is no optimal when you are innovating because you're always creating something new. And so you have to make these investments without any guarantee of return. There's a technological market, competitive uncertainty about whether you're going to get a return. And to do this, you have to have within an enterprise something that I call strategic control. You have to, it really matters who is making these decisions and why they're making decisions, what incentives they have to invest in innovation, to confront this uncertainty and try to be innovative. And the second characteristic of innovation is that it's collective, that you don't do it all alone, that it involves people working together who have different capabilities, different responsibilities, and to engage in what we might call organizational learning. That if we knew how to do everything now, when we invest in something, it wouldn't be innovation. So innovation is connected to a learning process. And to do this, you need to integrate people into an organization. You have to get people to cooperate to engage in this process. And the third characteristic of the innovation process is it's cumulative. It can't be done all at once. It takes time, and this, again, is why you need finance. You have to sustain this process, and I call this financial commitment. Now, these three terms, really social characteristics of an innovative enterprise, I summarize as strategic control, organizational integration, financial commitment. They're relationships, and you really have to see the business enterprise as an organization based on various types of relationships that make strategy, organize the learning process, and sustain that process by financing it until it could generate returns. And I could go on for a long time explaining how that works and why that is a very, in fact, difficult process. What's important is it's an organizational process. This is not something that's driven by markets. This is something actually where markets are the outcome of successful organization. Again, I could go on for a couple hours about that. Okay, now, when you do have successful innovation, you have the potential for what I call sustainable prosperity. You have something that can be shared out among what is often called various stakeholders in the economy. You can have employees get higher pay and better work conditions, creditors more secure paper, shareholders higher dividends or share prices, governments can get higher taxes, firms stronger balance sheets, and cut off at the bottom there is consumers can get higher quality, lower cost products. So this is the possibility of innovation. Now, that may not happen that way because, in fact, it may happen that certain parties, and this is basically what's happened increasingly in a country like the United States, are able to position themselves to grab all the benefits of innovation, partly because it's a cumulative and collective process, and in a certain process, it's people make contributions now, and down the line, someone may, in fact, come and grab a lot of those returns. And it may not be the people who actually made the investments. And the group of people who are grabbing all those returns in the United States are not so much shareholders, but top executives. And they are increasingly in that top 1/10 of 1%. I don't have time to really give you the data on that. Okay, so, and this came out of this new business model, which was highly tied up with the stock market, which was applying a revolutionary technology. So in far as we could see, and we all are affected by it, we experience the benefits in many ways of this technological revolution. But in fact, you had a set of institutions that came into being in that context in the United States, really based around the stock market, that led to a lot of inequity and instability in the economy. And I'll explain that now. Here is just a comparison that's in my book of the old economy business model and the new economy business model, in which I just make the main point here is this increased role of the stock market in the new economy business model. Okay, now this is a picture of the S&P 500 index, companies that are about 75% of the market capitalization of companies in the United States. And that's the blue line, and NASDAQ, which is the S&P 500 index includes about 80 companies that are on NASDAQ. The rest are on the New York Stock Exchange. And you can see that in the late 1990s, NASDAQ went crazy and then went up, and what went up came down. And in the last decade, they've both been going up and down, been very, very volatile. The stock market has been much more stagnant. This is in numbers, what you just saw there. And that highlighted line, the price yield, really says what you need to see here, that in the 1980s and 1990s, if you were holding stocks, you have to be a total idiot not to make money. And everybody was making money who held stocks, whether it was in pension funds or whatever. But also you have to be a total idiot, and unfortunately I say 99.9% of the American population were total idiots, because when I talked to people, I just couldn't make this point in the 1990s, including very intelligent people who were worried about what was happening to jobs, etc. You cannot sustain, if the whole population is trying to make 13% to 15% on the stock market, that kind of return. It could not be sustained, and since everybody's pensions were in there, this was a big sector of the population trying to get this much money out of the economy. In fact, what they were doing was taking money out of the economy, and in retrospect, not putting money into the economy. Now this is a picture of the, which becomes very relevant in the last decade, of something called stock buybacks, which many people don't even know that they exist in the United States, but they are the American disease. Stock buybacks, stock repurchases are the American disease, and I'll come back to those in a little more detail in a minute. Basically, what this picture shows is the stock repurchases by the S&P 500 companies pushing the S&P 500 index, stock market index, to a new peak in 2007, even higher than it was in the speculative boom of 2000, and before it came down in the financial crisis. And basically, when I take this picture again of the stock market over the last 3 decades, I argue the 3 things that have driven the stock market: innovation, speculation, manipulation. Now, back in the early 1980s, what I mean by innovation, by old economy business model companies, companies like IBM, Motorola, Texas Instruments, Dow Chemical, DuPont, etc., is that what they started doing, companies started doing, is starting laying off lots of people and to boost their stock price. So you'd see quite regularly in newspapers that company lays off 10,000 people, stock market soars. Somehow this is supposed to be good for the economy. This was restructuring the economy. General Electric was a company, I'll come back to General Electric in a second, which was very good at doing this. Okay, then, but meanwhile, covering this up was the fact that you really did have innovation. So a company like Cisco or Microsoft or Intel, they were actually, their stock market price was rising, mainly because they were introducing new goods and services and getting not just a dominant market share in the United States, but globally. Then on top of that, then people started speculating in those stocks, and it came crashing down. And over the last decade, it's really been manipulation using this device of stock buybacks. Okay, now let me just go into what that all means. Here are the ways in which the stock market undermines innovation. If you remember, I said there are these three social conditions of innovative enterprise: strategic control, organizational integration, financial commitment. Okay, you start paying people at the top through stock-based compensation, and you actually undermine their incentive to invest in innovation. Some people call it short-termism, etc. And a key instrument in doing this was the stock options for top executives, and a way in which they help boost the value of their stock options, it turns out, was stock buybacks. The second way is that you start inducing people to jump from one company to another, looking for the best bargain in terms of the company will give them stock options, and this went down through the organization. And you start undermining the organizational learning process in companies. And the final thing is that you actually drain money out of companies. And this is the thing I'll talk about most through these giving money out to shareholders. Now, and I'll skip over this very quickly. The result of this has been the things I showed before. The increasing concentration of income at the top, erosion of middle class employment, as companies actually have gotten rid of people that had stable blue-collar jobs, then had white-collar jobs, but they got rid of the notion of a career with one company. That happened in the 1990s. And then in the last decade, a lot of jobs have been just shifted overseas. And these are not been necessarily low-wage jobs, often high-wage jobs, and jobs that require a lot of educational credentials and experience. And as a result, there's been increasingly, each time we have a recession, we've had a jobless recovery, and each one has been more severe in that when you try to come out of recession, the jobs are just not there. And this is not a cyclical thing, this is a structural thing, a long term. Okay, and the result at the same time has been what I showed before, this concentration of income at the top. The 2008 financial crisis was really an employment crisis. It was really around the housing market, and what was called the subprime crisis. But you think about it, basically what it was is that coming into the 1980s, there was this notion of sustainable prosperity, endless prosperity. Everybody was going to move up the ladder. And to some extent, that had been happening in the post-World War II decades. And one way in which you crown this achievement, let's say, was by owning your own home. And there's a lot of things that encourage you in terms of tax laws, et cetera, to own your own home in the United States anyway. But in addition, you got in the 1980s securitization. It became much easier to get a mortgage. And also you had a lot of community activism, which said, yeah, even people who have low income should be able to own homes. Well, at the same time, the jobs that would in fact allow people to own homes were disappearing. But the financial industry, looking for high returns, said, hey, let's lend to those people anyway, get the high returns while we can, because as long as the housing prices keep going up, they can finance, they can try to pay the higher rates out of the increased housing prices until it came crashing down. But basically, the financial crisis was an employment crisis, was the result of the disappearance of these jobs. Okay, in the process, these jobs were not replaced, mainly because companies had become financialized. The official ideology was that you didn't run companies to innovate, to create jobs, to create stability, higher incomes in the economy. You ran companies to maximize shareholder value. Now, this ideology was not around at the beginning of the 1980s. It was dominant by the end of the 1980s. I actually spent time from about 1983 through the rest of the 1980s into the 1990s. I was around Harvard Business School a lot, and I saw that, in fact, it wasn't there in 1983, 84. It was dominant, totally dominant by the end of the decade. And partly it was because of the people they hired who were teaching this, and it was because this is what executives wanted to hear. They wanted to hear that what we were running companies for is to maximize shareholder value. What they were actually doing was increasing incomes. Now, you may have heard of this guy, Jack Welch, who would often be seen as the CEO of the century in the United States. Has been described that way. Was the head of General Electric, company that dates back to the 1870s. He was the head of it from 1981 2001. And when he retired, he wrote this book, Jack, Straight from the Gut, which was supposed to tell you everything you had to know about how he ran General Electric. But it took him a while to get some things out of his gut and really tell you what he really thought. And this was a interview in the Financial Times in 2009, where he said, on the face of it, shareholder value is the dumbest idea in the world. Shareholder value is a result, not a strategy. Your main constituencies are your employees, your customers, and your products. Now, I actually totally agree with what he said, but I think the interviewer must have had a totally shocked look on his face. We don't have a video of this, because he then felt that he had to repeat what he just said. It is a dumb idea. The idea that shareholder value is a strategy is insane, is a product of your combined efforts from the management to the employees. Now, why was this surprising? Well, it's because everybody thought that Jack Welch was a shareholder value guy, that this is what he had been arguing all along as CEO. And it turns out that you can actually never find Jack Welch. He never made this argument. In fact, it's not in the annual reports of General Electric. It is now. It's under a guy named Jeffrey Immelt, who will freely make this argument in the United States that we run companies to maximize shareholder value, even as he says we need more manufacturing in the United States, etc. But Jack Welch was a little smarter than that. He never made that argument. Nevertheless, he relentlessly pursued, through the operation of General Electric, a strategy of getting their stock price up, and he was largely successful. Now, one way he did this, something he did say, which he's most famous for, he's saying General Electric is only going to be in industries where we're number one or number two. He made this argument when he became CEO in 1981. At that time, they were in about 300 different businesses, and he basically took the ones that were the best, and then they stayed in number one or number two. Then they added financial services, which almost caused them to crash a couple of times, but in good times for General Electric, that's what makes the most of their money. Okay, now this dominant idea is, this dumb idea is a dominant managerial ideology. A lot of people think this is a shareholder ideology. It's not. Shareholders actually have very little power in the United States. This is a managerial ideology. This is something that top managers love, because what it says is that we can just get the stock price up. We'll be evaluated on that basis. We'll be rewarded on that basis. And if the whole company goes to hell in 10 years or 5 years, well, that's not our responsibility. We're maximizing shareholder value. Now, the fact is, it's a phony ideology of innovation, because taxpayers contribute to companies, and without a guarantee of return, which is what the argument about shareholder value is that the only people who contribute companies without a guaranteed return are shareholders, therefore they have to get the value distributed to them. Workers contribute to companies without a guaranteed return. Just talk about this very, very quickly. The United States, as I said before, if you look at its history, the state is involved in every major industry, preparing the way for business to come in and make money through development of technology, infrastructure, etc. Then, of course, one of the problems is business comes in and starts making money, and some people, particularly the people at the top, start saying, well, that's all ours. And that's what shareholder value ideology has been used. Here's one example of the government spending money in the United States. The budget of the National Institutes of Health, which funds life sciences in the United States, is currently about $32 billion a year. You can see here that from in 2011 dollars, it's almost about $800 billion since it was founded. You do not have a pharmaceutical industry, a biotechnology industry, probably not just in the United States, anywhere without this funding. And in fact, it's twice in real terms now as it was in the early 90s. So it's not that it's any less, it's a lot more. This slide's a little screwed up here, but basically what it's saying is that anytime you hire somebody, if all they do is the work for a wage. You hire someone for $10 and they work for $10 or $20, work for $10, and you don't care about them and you replace them the next day. Yeah, okay, then that's just a wage in which there's no innovation going on. But anybody who runs a company knows that that's not what you want out of people. You want people to interact with other people, be creative, and the expectation is that they'll get rewarded in the future. And in fact, that's in effect what the old economy business model does. That's what secure employment did and does in companies. And this is what the new economy business model does not do. It, in fact, created the license to just get rid of people as soon as they became too expensive, and in fact is basically robbing a lot of people, not a lot of people, I'd say huge numbers of people who have invested their time and effort in building organizations and then don't share in the returns. Okay, so who shares in these returns? Well, this is a picture of the net equity issues of companies, and the blue line is non-industrial, is non-financial companies. And you can see that from the 1980s, net equity issues of companies, that is the issues of stock on the stock market versus stock taken off the stock market, which can come through stock repurchases, acquisitions, etc., has been negative. And you can see it's wildly negative between 2003 and 2007, and becoming quite highly negative again now. Now, if you put this in gross terms, that is in terms of just the amount that's being bought back, that's what this chart does. And it shows you going back to the early 1980s, tracing about almost 300 companies back that were in the S&P 500 index in 2008. You can see that stock buybacks, that blue line, were kind of minimal in the early 1980s, and they became more and more important, and surpassed dividends as a form of distributing corporate cash to shareholders in 1997, and then went wild in the 2000s. This is the same picture from 1997 on for a larger group of companies. And if you just look for 2001 to 2007, the same companies that were in the index for this period of time, to 2010, that decade, you see that it's $2.7 trillion in buybacks. Now, the United States is a big country, but $2.7 trillion is a lot of money just to be throwing out there to buy back your stock. It's basically manipulating your stock price. If you add that to the dividends of these companies, which are core to the U.S. economy, the distributions to shareholders basically over this period of time was 94% of net income. Okay. What they didn't do was invest in jobs, invest in innovation. And I'll just go on for, what, I have about 5 minutes left? Or okay, I'll just go on for another 5 minutes and just give you some indication of how and who didn't do this and how it was not done. This just gives you the, for this period, 2001, 2010, the top repurchasers in the United States, a lot of, even in Australia, you've heard about a lot of these companies, a lot of them are here, I'm sure. So ExxonMobil, which, talk about resources, makes windfall profits all the time from its control over petroleum refining, and gets all kinds of subsidies from the US government to do this, has averaged over that decade about $18 billion a year in buying back its stock. Okay. This is just taking stock off the market and just putting it in its treasury. Microsoft is next, IBM, you go down the list. I color-coded these to indicate different industries, because part of the research that we have on this phenomenon is then to look in these different industries and particular companies in these industries to see what impact this has. Here's the number 26 to 50. You can see companies in financial services, pharmaceuticals, oil refining, military technology, United Technologies, Lockheed Martin, etc. Okay, it's been about, for the whole of the S&P 500, it's about $3 trillion over the past decade, and this continues. It's about $400 billion last year. It'll be about $400 billion this year. These are the top companies for top 25 for 2011. Okay, now here's the other side of stock buybacks. I call this the kind of the yin and yang of corporate compensation, is the stock option. Okay, now what this shows is for the highest paid corporate executives in the United States. This comes from data that they have to submit on their proxy statements for annual general meetings of shareholders of the CEO pay and the other top 4 executives. You can see that in 1992, 3, 4, around there, it was for the, let's say the top 100 is about $20 million on average in 2010 dollars. Now at that time, this was already seen as excessive in the United States. This was about 100 times the earning of the average worker. In 1980, it had been 40 times the earnings of the average worker. I once heard a union leader in the United States said 40 to 1 is enough, and I immediately say 40 to 1 was way too much. There's no other country in the world that pays anywhere near, major country that pays anywhere near 40 to 1 to the top executives. That's what it was in 1980. Okay, it's been as high as 500 or 525 to 1 in 2000, around the peak of the internet boom. But in 2004 to 2007, it was 3 times in real terms what it was in the early 90s. Whatever cut you take, the top 100, top 500, top 1,500, it was for the top 100 is about almost $70 million per person. Among these top, the highest paid executives. And it starts making $10 million seem like absolutely nothing. I mean, and this is the way these people look at it. Is $10 million is nothing. That's bad pay. That's a really bad year. And so what they do is when they have a bad year, the board gives them lots more stock options, so when the stock price goes back up, they make even more. Now who's sitting on the boards? Other corporate executives who are paid the exact same way. How do they determine what they should pay the other corporate executives? They hire consulting companies to benchmark what all of them are paid. So they're benchmarking each other and constantly approving the benchmarks and saying, okay, you're worth it. And it's a very nice club that they have there. And you know, if you can get into it, you'll be rich forever. Okay, again, in the 1980s and 90s, anybody who was getting stock options was going to make money, but that became more difficult in the 2000s. So what they did is they stepped up the way in which they can manipulate the stock market. And this is through stock repurchases. And by the way, stock repurchases are manipulation. Now who says this? It's on the books of the Securities and Exchange Commission that large-scale repurchases of stock by corporations can be seen as manipulation. Okay. And but basically, in the early 1980s, they said, it's called the safe harbor, you can do it, and we won't charge you with manipulation. Okay, now, the impact of this is that, which I have to skip through very quickly, is that in various industries, you're doing these repurchases while you've been having adverse impact on the economy. So you may know, I'll just give one example here. Healthcare premiums, healthcare is very costly. Every bit of profit that the private healthcare insurers make and more goes to boosting their stock prices. Some of the CEOs of these companies have made as much as $125 million in 1 year just from their stock options. Okay, you can see in petroleum refining, they're doing this and not investing in higher energy. Pharmaceuticals, pharmaceutical prices are twice what they are in the United States as any other country. They go to Congress and they say we have to keep them high because we spend all this money on R&D in the United States. Well, any idiot congressman, if they want to stop being an idiot, they could see that they're spending more of it on repurchases than they're spending on R&D. Okay, let me wrap up here. What's to be done about all this? Well, here's what I would advocate. Is that you regulate employment contracts, so any workers who contribute to the innovation process share in the gain of the innovation. Create work programs that make productive use of capabilities of people who companies decide they no longer need. There's a huge, huge waste of human capital in the United States, people in their 40s, 50s, and 60s who have all this experience and companies just decide they're too expensive, and they end up, those skills atrophy very quickly. You can implement taxes on those gains from innovation. In fact, it's just gone the other way. You should, on stock options, basically, the way these things are structured, the stock price goes up, you make more money. It doesn't matter. Manipulation, speculation, get rid of that. Totally ban stock buybacks. They're just a manipulation of the market. Put people on boards of directors who are not part of this club, and reject the ideology of shareholder value. Now, to do this would basically require a social revolution in the United States, or at least a revolution in social norms. Thanks.